So today, what I would like to talk about are a couple of revolutions. We've already talked about the English. They have their own civil war, I suppose a revolution in a way. We have the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But now we're going to talk about revolutions outside of the British Isles. And in this case, we're going to be looking at the French revolutions and the American revolutions. But I'll talk about the Americans first because chronologically, that's the one that we are closest to. Now, revolutions are important, not to say that they're not important at any other point, but what we're going to see with these two revolutions coming up is a monumental shift in ideology. And this is partially going to be fed by the British and others, but also some of that will feed back into Britain. And there'll be consequences to these revolutions to Britain. And that's kind of interesting. So we are sort of interested in mostly to the British response to the American and the French revolutions. Some of them obviously, but the American Revolution is much more important to the British than, say, the French in a way. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what we have with the American Revolution is that the English are trying to do what we would call empire building. And it kind of looks a little bit like this, hopefully. And what we have is really the beginnings of the British Empire, and it will look a little bit like this. There are a number of European powers who are all jostling for things around the world. And as you can see, it's largely concentrated in particular areas, notably North America, South America, and then little bits and pieces around the coastal lines of Asia and Africa. Eventually, the British and others will get down to places like Australia, but for the moment, we are mostly interested in the areas that produce things that are that produce that give a large return on money. And so this will be things like spices from the East Indies, gold and silver from South America, and I guess things like sugar and rum and whatnot from the Americas, the North Americas, and the islands around it. So what we have is this is the situation. And the American Revolution really is a result of empire building by the British. It's probably important to note that it's not particularly directed, as in the empire building that Britain engages in is quite haphazard. It's not thought out and planned, say, like the Spanish. We just sort of end up with stuff. Notably, we might gain it by conquest. So, for example, we fought the Dutch a lot, which is a little unusual considering our history with them. But we fought the Dutch in various places, not in Holland, but outside. And we ended up gaining their colonies. Or for example, through strategic attacks, we gained things like Gibraltar, which is a little bit on the bottom of Spain. And that's just two examples of the different ways in which Britain and other countries really engaged in some sort of empire building. Britain is really part, or it exists within an economic understanding of the world, and that economic of the world really is something called mercantilism. And mercantilism is it's an economic theory. Where it says that the nation, so it's the nation. In normal economics, people and what people produce are the important parts. In mercantilism, it's mostly the nation, which is the main actor. As in, if you want something to happen, the nation has to get involved as a nation state. And the simple, I guess, theory behind it is that money is finite. You cannot generate more wealth. So the earth contains a certain amount of wealth in it, and what happens is that it's divided out between various people, various countries. And of course, if you want to have more of that wealth, you cannot generate it yourself. You have to gain it. Because remember, at this point, while we have had a banking system for maybe 80 years in Britain and other countries too, it's not as well developed as it is now. So what we do know is that if you want to generate money, you have to take it from other people. And so countries engage in this activity of going to other places and taking other people's money, which is quite nice of them. And so what people tended to do was to form corporations. So merchants would join together and form these chartered companies or corporations. And what they would do is it would give, the king would give you an area or perhaps a commodity that you could go and exploit. And so off you go and exploit it, and then you bring it back, and the king would take his cut, and you would take your cut, and then everybody would make money and everything would be happy. And so what happens then is most of the corporations, or well, many of the corporations ended up engaging in creating colonies. And so some of, I believe, the American early states are such ventures. Not all the time. There are some other sort of more very clearly money-oriented expeditions, such as the East India Company and things like this. But they engage in a wide variety of activities, where really I'm trying to say here. And so when Britain really does all this, it's important to note that it engages it without very much control. The Spanish, as I said earlier, rigidly controlled all of their stuff. Britain, no, we let you off to your own devices. And so you set off a thing in motion, and you don't really know what's going to happen to it and how it's going to end. So when it comes to the Americans, then the Americans are probably neglected. At least we're talking about the North Americans here. And they are left to themselves, and that probably means that things are going to go wrong, and it's not helped by a boom in population, which is also a sign of, well, great wealth, I suppose, but also you've then got more people to manage, and it's going to become more difficult to manage them. Now, in Britain at the moment, we have a couple of things. We have the people in charge, I guess, of Parliament at the moment. Lord North. This is Lord North here. He is in power, and he is opposed by what are known as the Rockingham Whigs. The man in charge of that runs by the name of Charles Wadsworth Wentworth, the second Marquis of Rockingham. And anyway, the Rockingham Whigs are in opposition to Lord North. They are in opposition to the position which Lord North takes, which leads to the American Revolution. They are the first to reconcile with America after the American Revolution. Edmund Burke, who I'll talk about a little bit later, is definitely part of this group. Now, as all good Americans might know, the whole thing kicks off with the Boston Tea Party, which really comes as a result of the 1773 Tax Act, or Lord North's Tea Act. This reduced the tea tax to the colonies, and this results in the Boston Tea Party, which we have a lovely picture here. The British actually saw all of this as very infantile, and so they began to sort of engage in coercive legislation. The colonies around them were paranoid. The Americans were paranoid. Well, okay, I guess we should call them British at the minute. The British Americans are paranoid because Quebec had been granted Catholic rights. And if you remember from the last lecture, or when we talked about religion and how many Protestants are worried that Catholics will begin to gain certain powers and rights and abuse those powers and rights, which will end up in the destruction of Protestantism. So we have then this thing, and then of course I don't really want to go through the American Revolution too much into detail. We've got the shot heard around the world in 1775 at Concord. This kicks off the whole process. We have agitators such as Tom Paine. Tom Paine is you will read about him in your textbook, in your sources book. And what this really shows is that there is a very lively, I suppose, excuse me, a very lively pamphleting atmosphere, which, if you remember from the last lecture, was already taking place in England at the time. So we really are continuing this sort of a thing. Thomas Paine writes The Common Sense, and it begins to focus the rebel sentiments. And of course, in 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence here, and everybody signs it, and that kind of ends the war, sort of. The progress of the war, really, as you all know, Canada was loyal to the British. There was a general containment until about 1777. And what happened really was that the French started to get involved. The French, in fact, started funding the Americans to a huge, it was a huge amount of money. I think somewhere in the region of 600 million livres at the time, or as one of my students once wrote, 600 million livres, which is definitely not what's going on there. But this caused the French to go into debt, which I think is part of the reasons why they ended up with their own revolution a couple of years later, because just things were not going well for them. There is lots of British support for the Americans, and it's kind of important to notice this. Edinburgh is one of them, as I said. The Whigs were generally unhappy with Lord North themselves. Charles Fox is Charles James Fox. Charles Fox was even turned up to Parliament wearing an American military uniform, which I don't think would really happen anymore. I don't think you can just waltz into the House of Commons and start wearing other people's military uniforms, especially ones that they're engaged in insurrection against. But this is really just one of those things that shows the sentiment in Britain and how much people think that the whole thing is kind of useless and a waste of time. And it is, in a way, because the events at home are much more important than what's going on in the periphery. In Parliament, for example, in 1780, John Dunning here, as you can see, John Dunning introduces or attempts to put forward a motion that the influence of the crown is increasing and ought to be diminished. In other words, they are more concerned about the concerns of the crown. If you remember last week, we talked about the fears about absolutism and the increasing of the power and authority of the crown versus the parliament. Here we have, he puts forward this motion. It's carried by 233 votes to 218, which is kind of a near half split, but still shows that there is enough sentiment floating around Britain at this point, I suppose, where they don't really they're more focused on what's happening in their own country than they are about what's happening on the outskirts. There are a number of reform movements that happened as a consequence of the American Revolution. Here we have Reverend Christopher Wyville. Christopher Wyville created the association movement in response to increased taxes, which came about because of the American War, because you have to fund a war, and the British have to get that money from somewhere, and so they begin to tax British people. There's a London branch of this association movement led by a man called John Cartwright. He begins to start throwing forward some very radical ideas about the enfranchisement of everybody over 18. Now, he's only talking about males at this point. He's not talking about women. But the ideas are here that there should be, in a way, more political representation, which of course is what the Americans have been clamoring for anyway. But there are other things happening in England, and I've said this on at least a couple more occasions. There are things like the Gordon riots. Excuse me. And the Gordon riots come about because of the 1778 Papist Act, which removed penalties against the Catholics. Virtually most of those penalties were never actually enforced. They're a bit like ghost acts that you have in statute books of things like you're not supposed to, I don't know, whistle on Christmas Day or something weird like that. It's never used, but they're there. And Lord Gordon becomes president of the Protestant Association in 1779, attempts to repeal this removal of the penalties against Catholics, and spreads fear of papism. There was a fear that Catholics would join up with the continental Catholics, they would attack England, we'd end up with absolute rule, all the general fears of Protestants, which probably at this point are not quite valid, but they have been valid in the past. And I think maybe perhaps some people understood that to be true. And so what's happening with Gordon is that people then start rioting, and that's never a good thing. 60,000 people march on Parliament. They are dispersed with soldiers. It eventually turns into rioting, as all good demonstrations do. Ends up with the destruction of Newgate Prison. Prisoners in there escape. Some of them are never recaptured. British problems. This is really what we have. And what happens is that Lord North, who we met at the very beginning, attempts to form a coalition with Rockingham. And the Whigs put forward some terms about this reconciliation. They say, okay, this is what we need. We want American recognition. We want recognition of the American independence. We would like some economic reforms back at home and dismissal of leading ministers. So North sort of says, I don't like this so much. So he calls a general election, which he wins. But unfortunately, Lord Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown in 1781. George III wants to fight, but North really doesn't. And in 1782, Henry Conway puts forward a vote in February to end the war, which passes 234 to 215 votes. Lord North resigns, obviously because his administration has sort of come a cropper here. Rockingham forms his own administration with Charles Fox in the lead in the House of Commons. So that is the American War. And there are some things to note. This is largely for Americans, or some things that are largely for Americans. Number one is that the British lost the War of Independence largely because the British Navy was in the Mediterranean because of the French. Strategically, America is not important. Strategically, the Mediterranean is. And so you must think of the rest of the British Empire, not just one part of the British Empire. Liberty is not really the main issue either. Lots of slaves and lots of Native Americans joined the British. And they could have had, a much better time, quote unquote, maybe under the Americans had they fought against the British, but they didn't. So it's not really a main issue. It's a galvanizing issue, and it certainly is true for at least at some sort of conceptual level for many people. But yes, we could have won the war, perhaps, had we had not other bits of the empire or been more interested in other parts of the empire. But as it turned out, Britain did much better after the war. Trade increased and relations improved with the Americans, much better than they had had from before. And so what happened is that Britain and the British became more proud of being British because in their own minds, they are beset on every side. You've got the Americans to the west, you've got all the Europeans to the east. We had the Great Siege of Gibraltar a few years later in 1779 to 83, which was defended, and we won that. And we still hold it to this day, just to annoy the Spanish, I think. In Ireland, it's very true. This is, let me move on a slide here. Excuse me. In Ireland, the Irish Protestants supported the Americans. There's a lot of Scottish-Irish support due to immigration, mostly due to the Jacobites. Remember about them, the ones who think that James really should be on their throne. They are an echo in the past, but that's really what it's like. And this really opens eyes to what's going on at home. So, for example, why should British people hold Irish offices? Much like the Americans saying, why should the British be telling us what to do over here? The people in Ireland start doing the same thing as well. And the Irish suffer trade disruption due to the war. The British controlled it. And so the Irish organize a British boycott of goods. And as the war goes wrong, Parliament begins to grant Ireland free trade in the empire. And so Ireland starts to gain a measure of legal and legislative independence, mostly in response to pressure from militia groups, which become a political force, which is kind of interesting because that's rather what's happened with the IRA during the 1970s and 80s and 90s. Start out as a militia force, but then they push their way into a political force. But Ireland now finds itself in a situation much like Scotland did in 1707, with an independent parliament, and they could cause trouble in Westminster, and that's kind of something to note. So, excuse me, what we have then is the beginning of the expansion of the British Empire because of the collapse of the Americans, because we're no longer doing anything with America. It allows Britain to focus its efforts in different parts of the world. And that means, well, it just means we can do more things in more places. They still retain Canada, or America's hat, as some people like to call it. They still have large parts of the Caribbean, of Africa, of India, and they expand these areas. And what they begin to do is change the concept of what a colony is, of what an empire is. An empire is not just white colonies. An empire is annexation and conquering of other places. As I said at the beginning, Britain really wasn't focused on what it was doing. It's kind of a haphazard way of doing that. Now it's much more focused. And the excuse me, the revolution also had unexpected and far-reaching consequences too. Deprived of a dumping ground for British conflicts, Britain had actually, the joke is always that Britain settles Australia with convicts, and Britain also did the same thing with America. They dumped 50,000 people there, which caused Benjamin Franklin to remark that the Americans should send back rattlesnakes in return for the 50,000 men and women that Britain had dumped on there. And so Britain then turns to Australia, which then sort of helps them develop Australia. France's relative weakening through the costs of war, as I mentioned earlier, it bankrupted the French, enhanced Britain's strategic position. And France's embattled finances would actually be one of the root causes of, or it would help precipitate the French Revolution in 1789, leading to even greater challenges to the British nation, because that is a much more closer issue. But I'm going to stop on the American Revolution, and then shortly later we'll talk about the French Revolution and how that actually sort of altered much more in a way than anything that the Americans did. Although that's not to say that they're not sort of that important. It's just to say that the American Revolution is less vital to radical change within Britain. It certainly contributes to certain changes, but it's not as much as the French. But we'll talk about the French next time.